Good morning, everybody. Welcome back. Thank you for joining after the break. And as I understand, data protection, not privacy, data protection is the main topic here today, beside the economic impact of the numbers and the figures and the data here. The challenge today is also the data protection. And I read, real time, one of the statements of our Commissioner Nellie Kroes and about the fear for the lack of protection of users online. So we see that there is going to be a big challenge here in Europe, particularly during this year and the coming year because of the new regulation. But we will have a chance to discuss that. I have a great panel, and I don't want to give too much information about them because there's a booklet where you can find all the information. But I'm very happy to welcome here with me Ed Black, that is the president and CEO of Computer Communication Industry. I have Luca Bolognini, who is the president of the Italian Institute of Privacy and the European Privacy Association. I have my colleague here, John Cabot, Daniele Pica, who has a doctorate from London Schools of Economics, and then we have already met him because I guess, where is he? Oh, here you are. Because he spoke before in representation of the GSM Association is Pat Walshe. So I would rather go by alphabetical order, if you allow me. That's the smartest data way, or the oldest way to analyze data. And I would like to give 10 minutes each, 10 minutes each. I have a beautiful lady there that she's running the clock for me. So I'll follow her, but please follow her too, so I give blame to her. So alphabetical order, 10 minutes. As I said, it's a great challenge. It's a great Europe challenge for Europeans, but also for a lot of American companies. And I have to say, more for American companies than for European companies. The new regulation is in place, but don't forget about the existing directive, like the 9546 or the 2058. And as I said, the new regulation, that is obviously going to change a lot in the interpretation of data protection and in the way of doing business. A lot of companies came to us as European Privacy Association, and they are worried about the 2% fine that they might take when they come to, when they do wrong practice. Some company can say, we make billions, who cares about 2%? But then there is a second element I was discussing yesterday with my friend Luca Bolognini, that there is also the intervention of police forces. So if you don't pay your 2%, or if you pay your 2%, still there can be implementation of criminal law. So there is a criminal law that goes separate from the regulation, and most of the companies forget about it, and then they occur into incidents. So there are criminal sanctions, and that's an aspect that we might also keep in mind. As I said, there is the paradox, because if you think about the e-directive, the e-directive will remain the e-directive and will not be touched by the regulation, or will be partly touched by the regulation, but it will remain. And there are a series of other challenges in the regulation that I'm sure our speaker here will have the chance to discuss. One of them is, to conclude my introduction, the famous 27 different regulations, okay? So 27 different countries with 27 different regulations. That means 27 different lawyers for big corporations. And my friend Luca Bolognini is a lawyer, so he's probably the happiest person. Their regulations should erase that, meaning one regulation for all the countries. But as I said, the e-commerce directive instead says that any country can implement it in different ways. So is it true that we will have one regulation with less cost, but at the same time, if you think about e-commerce, it might be 27 different ways of working? But these are some of the challenges. At European Privacy, we run a breakfast every month at the European Parliament with different MEPs who are interested in the topic of privacy, and it's a great chance to discuss. And as I said, most of the attendees are American companies. So perhaps today is, again, a great chance to have the discussion. But I don't want to take too much of your time. It's a big topic. We want to conclude before 12:30, 12:25. So I know that everybody wants to talk about data protection. Before giving the word to Black, I would like to mention Luca Bolognini, because last week talking about data, you know, the word in data, the Latin word of data is given. So why protecting something that you're giving? Ed.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I welcome the opportunity to talk to all of you today about the economic impacts of privacy regulation. We're not going to try to rewrite the privacy regs here, I hope. At CCI, we've become more and more concerned with the importance of what we'll define as free flow of information, both as a human rights issue as also an important component of international trade. Although human rights issue is extremely important and has roots not only in U.S.-centric First Amendment, but also in Article 19 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, we increasingly have felt the discussion of free flow needs to also have an emphasis on the economic and trade aspects. Unimpeded information flows, being able to use things like best cloud platforms, social networks, or internet-based tools, wherever they are located, has huge economic significance and benefits. By the EU's own estimates, the increased adoption of cloud computing technologies would boost the collective European GDP by 600 billion euros in the era from 2015 to 2020. The increased use of cloud computing, e-commerce platforms, and services will benefit everyone, but the companies that benefit the most are small and medium-sized companies. The Internet certainly helps a Walmart further streamline its supply chains and increase its margins, but platforms like eBay, Mercado Libre, and Etsy are helping small businesses sell their goods and services worldwide in ways that only huge multinational corporations could do in the past. While big companies benefit some by moving their IT infrastructure into the cloud, SMEs, on a percentage basis, save much more by not having to build and maintain their own server rooms and IT resources. A recent McKinsey study, which I'm not the first today to mention, found that nearly 3/4 of the monetary benefits of the Internet accrue to traditional industries outside of the Internet industry itself through greater efficiency in the back office and greater access to new market and customers on the sales side. The Internet makes it much easier for an individual with good idea or unique product to scale their business and sell to anyone with an Internet connection. Too often, when commentators think about the Internet industry and international trade, they think of the money made by companies selling their ICT services overseas. But much more importantly, the Internet is an input into other industries, making non-Internet companies much more efficient and viable in the global marketplace. Countries that hinder their domestic access to global Internet are hurting the entirety of their domestic industry, not just their nascent Internet and ICT industries. That being said, regulators all over the world need to balance the need to preserve and promote laudable social goals, like privacy, with the economic harms of impeding the ability of their citizens from participating in the global internet marketplace. Well-meaning regulations almost always have unintended side effects, and these unintended side effects tend to manifest themselves more often in the new, quickly changing, and unpredictable Internet world. Studies have shown that Europe lags Latin America, Asia, and the U.S. in cloud computing adoption, partly as a result of unsettled privacy regulations that impede the full use of full-suite global Internet services. However, the U.S., partly as a result of other well-meaning legislation, in this case, Sarbanes-Oxley legislation relating to accounting, is also trailing Latin America and Asia in cloud computing. When domestic businesses are impeded from using the best Internet tools and services, this will harm that domestic industry's global competitiveness. This is a trade-off that politicians and regulators must consider when considering social policies and programs that might cut off their citizens from large swaths of the global Internet ecosystem. Internet markets for goods and services are competitive by and large, other than access, which we won't get into. and consumers can choose a level of privacy, security that they want. However, they need to be adequately informed, and companies should be policed so that they don't deceive the public. I would encourage regulators the world over to make disclosure and not prescriptive rules the focus of their internet regulation going forward. The market simply moves too fast for the consequences of poor regulation legislation that are hard to change can be economically dire. Cloud computing is just one example. Social networking, online education, international e-tailing are all cases where data must flow across borders and where well-meaning privacy regulations can actually have huge economic impacts, aside from the obvious and considerable social and free expression issues they create. Deloitte, in January of 12, released a study showing that in the EU alone, Facebook had an economic impact of $15.3 billion, as well as supporting 232,000 jobs. Booz & Company surveyed prominent internet European angel investors and venture capitalists and found that majorities would be deterred from investing because of privacy regulations, including mandatory opt-in, particularly per visit, and do not track. This is all a problem because under the fundamental premise of free flow of information is under a threat from many directions. Governments around the world have seen the power of internet services to help people and focus their shared view on the need for societal change, and some are scared by it. Too many have decided that limiting cross-border data flow is a way to preserve their own power and have begun censoring, blocking, or filtering the internet as a consequence. Others are doing the same, but with the objective of protecting their own citizens. The EU's Data Protection Directive, we think, is one example. It is important to have a healthy respect for the multitude of methods for protecting privacy, but at the same time, we do need to balance that desire with preserving the ideals and practical needs of a free flow of information. We are concerned that the Data Protection Directive and its successor being discussed in the Parliament may create an environment that leads to Europe falling further behind the rest of the world in innovation and access to services. Restrictions on transborder data flow, no matter how well meant, can have that effect. Privacy regulations are clearly important, certainly to EU citizens, but there are situations in which they can become barriers to free trade, and unintended economic effects may begin to compete with the intended projections. Technology changes rapidly, laws change slowly. Today's benefits can easily become tomorrow's limitations, and we must, as much as possible, resist the temptation to change the internet itself in order to combat serious, legitimate, but nevertheless social ills which are not always soluble in their totality. The internet is to our center, we've had a couple interesting metaphors today, but let me use the one of the steam engine to the Industrial Revolution. A technology shift back then which had tremendous impact. Okay, I'll go quicker here. The global medium, that's okay. Try to stay on time. The internet requires us to think differently, to leverage technology itself, to empower users to make their own decisions, empower innovators to compete to provide new ways to serve users in making those choices. This requires a different view of rulemaking, and even perhaps enforcement, one which suits enablement and empowerment over regulation. But after all, isn't that a core objective of data protection, the empowerment of individuals?
Thank you, Ed, so much. Strong approach, I would say, particularly for European Union and Commission. But you talk about balance. I think that was very interesting, and I guess the disclosure and not prescriptive rules was probably the most the interesting statement in your speech. Immediately, therefore, to Luca. I know you also have a proposal that you guys have been circulating here, so the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pietro. I think I was very interested listening to the previous panel and also to this speech, because I think that the devil is in the details, also in the details of my rusted English, but I will try to go fast and to be clear. I think that there are some elements, some issues, some articles, some concepts in current European laws, European regulation, that are not that friendly for business and digital business, for data processing, even for big data processing. For example, let's think about the general principles. If you think about the general principle, the fundamental principle we have in the current legislation, and we will have also in the new regulation, the principle of necessity, so that you cannot process data if those data, and collect data, if those data, this data is not strictly necessary for the service. This principle is the exact opposite of big data processing, where I need to collect the maximum amount of data. So we are violating European laws just speaking about big data processing. I disagree with this, but it is a problem. This is a general principle. Our data processing will be unlawful if we read exactly what is written in the current legislation and in the future regulation. Another issue, for example, but I could speak for hours, another issue is I agree, the difference between personal data and anonymized data, public data is very difficult. I agree with you. But another issue is the consent. And all the institution, I saw that in the new regulation there are other possibilities of lawfulness, of having lawful data processing over consent. This is a good news. But anyway, consent is the main element, is still the main condition for lawfulness of the data processing. And consent is something that online, in the digital environment, does not work, does not ensure the awareness, even the proudness, but the awareness of the data subjects, of the users. We must go, we shall go over consent. We shall bypass consent, I think, but not bypass data subjects' rights, users' rights. I'm not saying this. I'm saying that consent is nothing, is impossible or very difficult, too difficult to apply to digital environment. So, what can we do? We can do, in the same Article 6 of the new regulation, we can specify better the legitimate interests on the basis of which we can process data without users' consent. But that legitimate interest in the new regulation, also in the current legislation, but also in the new regulation, is not that clear, is not that sure. And I do think that businesses should have sure and clear rules, should respect something very, very, very immediate and clear. And so how could we do in order to bypass consent but ensure privacy and data protection rights? I have two proposals. One is this, and you find on the chairs, and another is the certification of the legitimate interest. We have an article in the new regulation, in the new proposal, that is the 39, is about certification of third parties. As it is written, in my opinion, it is an article almost useless, because the certification is something that you put here, and you say, yes, I'm very good processing data, but which is the effect of this certification? Why don't we link the 39, the certification in the proposal with an amendment, to the Article 6, and to the part of the Article 6 in the new regulation for data protection, in which we speak about legitimate interests. And we say that if you are going to process data, or even big data, for marketing purposes, and you are certified by a third party, ensuring transparency, ensuring fairness, ensuring the possibility for the users to choose and to opt out, obviously. So you can say you are processing data on the basis of a legitimate interest. You don't need to request for consents. This would mean to give an effective meaning to the certification of third parties. Otherwise, I wonder which could be the utility, the meaning of this certification. This is the first proposal. The second is this. We should think about a new business model. We should change our idea about online services. Not all online services. I know that some online services would never accept this proposal. But why don't we say that some services are not for free? Why don't we put inside the contract with the user the fact that the user will pay, and will pay with its data, with the possibility of processing its data for marketing purposes, for profiling, for behavioral advertising. So if we do so, I think it is already not sensitive data, obviously, but it is already something that is feasible with the current legislation and also with the future legislation, because we put inside in the contract this obligation, and we know that consent is not required when the data processing is part of the obligation of the contract, of which is part data subject or user in general. So let's think about these proposals. They are two, but we can talk about other solution, other proposals. Anyway, after not now, but after I would say something about criminal laws, national criminal laws, because it is interesting and there is an impact on digital businesses.
Thank you, Luca, very much for the two proposals from the concerns that raised. Already some proposals that I'm sure we've been studying here in Europe to find that balance. I want to now pass the ball to my colleague and thank him for being here and representing John Cabot. Please, Daniele.
Okay. Let me introduce myself quickly. I've worked with Simon Davis, which is Privacy International, so I come from a bit of a different perspective than the previous one. I find privacy to be a basic human right, so the way it's being commoditized here for industry and the way in which you say that you don't even have to seek consent for it appalls me for where I come from, okay? So let me tell you, instead my proposal, I think, should be to have actual agencies enforcing privacy laws, because that's what's not been happening whatsoever in Europe or in the US. Companies just get away with it. So here we're speaking about strict regulation. The problem is not regulation, it's the enforcement. Now, one of the things that I find through all this data, and I'm going to quote here without trying to insult anybody, Mark Twain, and he said it's not the figures lying, it's the liars figuring. So we can have a lot of data on how much we can make users. Facebook is already actually taking advantage of your proposal. We're sort of giving silent consent. In fact, their whole service and their whole marketing campaign is based on our data. However, I would like to point out, from a legal point of view, the consent that Facebook gets is not full consent, because users do not know how data is used by them. That is the problem. You give consent in the use of data. You just don't give, oh, take my data and do whatever you want with it. So I see this as a problem. Now, I've read also one of the articles about essentially data and why government should actually consider data as a third category. So we have goods, services, and data. However, I find, even going back to classical economics from Shapiro and Varian from Stanford University, they've actually looked at the economics of digital goods and services. There is no need to make a separate categories. We have transaction cost economics with Claudio Ciborra. And one of the things that I find right here, if we try to make an economy for data, we are making a basic fallacy. So one of the things that I find, I worked for the UK police for about 4 years on their implementation of information systems and what to do with the data, the extra data that they've got on people. Now, these companies, whether public or private, fall into a trap. Whatever can be measured will be measured. Now, we could do the same with our users, measure everything they do. But again, we go against fundamental human rights. Our own information is ours. It's not the government's, it's not the company's, and we should have full control over it. Right now, we have control only in a nominal way. Now, I teach a course here in innovation, which I took back. I used to work at the LSE for about 10 years. And what I tell my students, especially when they sign up for companies or for Facebook, Twitter, I say the best thing you can do, never withhold information from these companies. Okay, this might go against the industry, I'm so sorry. The best thing is to give fake information, because corrupt databases are the best thing. You want real information, you have to pay me real money. So, in a way, what I'm trying to say, okay, I'm perhaps a bit on the extreme, I'm on the other side. I think we should define what privacy is, first of all. We should define what data is, first of all. And if I define privacy as a human right, you cannot commoditize it. You cannot even give it a monetary value. And again, consent, we have to define how it's given and for what. Now, the last thing I want to say is I'm paranoid. I encrypt all of my emails. I use private mode of my browser. And so I'm sure, but I will corrupt the information giving others. I know. The only guy I give my information to was Steve Jobs. Now I cannot do it anymore. Now, I even go back to Lessig, that most of you, Lawrence Lessig, lawyer in the United States from Stanford, who argues that we should embed privacy in the code, okay? So not even give companies the choice of what policies to put there. We can actually embed everything in the code, okay? The code, in the same way encryption can be used when you send emails so that the government doesn't snoop around. And I don't like the government snooping around. So I'm against government gathering new data. They gather more than enough, I believe, especially in the US. And again, if you want my privacy, you really have to pay a lot for it. That is my proposal. About a couple million euros will do. Then I'll give you all access to my private life. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniele, so much. I like your proposal, and we have Google here or Microsoft, so we can definitely make a deal today. Maybe not a million deal, but some deal. Thank you for a very different approach, I would say, and very provocative as well. So that's very much appreciated, I guess, and it's definitely part of the debate and to enhance certainly the dialogue and the discussion. Pat from the USMA Association.
Hi, thank you. I think GSM Association is a trade body that represents 800 mobile phone operators around the world. So between them, they connect 6 billion mobile users. You know, we're going to be talking about the economic impact of privacy legislation. I haven't heard that yet, so I'll try and put some figures into context for you. I think in Europe also, it's important to bear in mind that our members in Europe connect 656 million active users. That's a significant number of people. In 2010, they supported 1.7 million jobs, and they contributed 174 billion euro to EU GDP. That was 1% of the total GDP for the EEA. So I think when we think about these rules, we should consider and bear some of these things in mind. Bear in mind that figure of 656 million when I talk about one aspect of the proposed European regulation soon. I think for me, one of the key things is that technology does continue to evolve. It continues to shape how data is generated, collected, analyzed, and used. Someone mentioned earlier, this is not just about personal data. Absolutely, it's not just about personal data, because the law protects personal data, but there are data categories that just because you can't identify it's Pat Walsh, nonetheless, those categories have privacy implications and consequences, not just privacy consequences, but economic consequences for me. How do we factor that in? But what I love about this technology is that it creates incredible opportunities that are empowering, they are transformative, but yes, they give rise to certain risks. And I think for me, we need to better identify and measure both the opportunities, the benefits, and the risks. And I see that missing from the policy and the legislative debate in Europe, and I also see it missing from the policy and legislative debate in the US. I should add, by the way, that I'm involved in debates around the world, not just in Europe, on privacy. I think it's a fact for me that the availability of data is shaping behaviors. It's providing goods and opportunities that are driving key sectors of the market. That's without doubt. Whether that's enabling and empowering individuals to make decisions, or whether it's enabling businesses to make decisions, or whether it's enabling governments to make decisions. I've heard a lot about advertising today. Well, whoopee. I like the fact that Amazon know what video I bought and what book I bought and tell me, hey, Pat, there's something over here you're interested in, because I quite like that, actually. But let's not lose sight of the fact that when we talk about big data, big data has the ability to provide real social goods from which communities, individuals, and societies can derive real benefit. We lose sight of that. If I think about Haiti, how many of you remember the Haiti earthquake? Well, the ability to use location data in an anonymized way was crucial in determining where people moved to delivering life-saving assistance. So let's not just keep the debate about the fact that somebody knows what DVD and book I bought. There are other real crucial things that we have to think about, I think. Yes, regulators are concerned, there are pressures coming about, but let's take the fact that we talked about, I think, Pietro, you talked about one regulation, one rule. Actually, there isn't one rule. And in Europe, we're talking about one regulation. Well, actually, the law skews the market. It creates competition consequences. We have the e-privacy directive. Yeah, and we talk about big data. The e-privacy directive doesn't apply to the Googles and the others of the world in the same way that it applies to mobile network operators or fixed-line telecommunications companies. They have more restrictive rules and prohibitions on their use of data than do the other OTT players that process functional equivalent data that have equivalent privacy risks and implications and consequences. So that has, so let me give you an example. The Article 29 Working Party determined that GPS and wireless LAN location data are not subject to the e-privacy regulations. Why not? Because they're an information society service and they are not a publicly available electronic communications network service, which means that your cellular location data is regulated. And there are rules around what can and can't be done with that. But your GPS and wireless LAN data, those are rules. So think about the economic consequences of that particular rule on the market, on players in the market. But let me introduce something from Canada, because when I look at research and statistics and information on the economic consequences of privacy regulation, there's a lot missing in Europe. The European Parliament ITRE Committee commissioned a report last year on the impact of privacy regulation on innovation. It doesn't really give you the data. ENISA recently published a report on monetizing privacy. Doesn't really give you the data. So there was a report published in February of this year, It was on the economic impact of privacy regulation, and it was in Canada, and it was published by the Conference Board of Canada. And what they found was that the cost of administering privacy regulation is estimated at $3.8 billion annually in an economy of $1.7 trillion. That's 0.28 of the economy. Altogether, the cost of complying with regulation in Canada was found to be $30.5 billion. That's significant. And what they found was that in the $3.8 billion for complying with privacy regulation, that 45% of those costs were in the retail and finance sectors. So there's some good work that's been done. There are issues with the research, but what I'd like to see is similar research in Europe and elsewhere, actually, because the thing about privacy is it's global. The thing is about privacy, there's an attempt to regulate and protect privacy by a patchwork of geographically bound laws. Well, they don't cut the mustard anymore, because my privacy interests, which my expectations, my needs, my wants, they transcend those geographically bound borders, just as my data crosses those borders instantaneously between multiple parties. I can download one app. There will be 7 different parties sharing that data across the world. Now let's go back to something else, put it back into concrete about the impact of privacy law. So, Luca, you mentioned a greater focus on consent, for example, in the proposed General Data Protection Regulation. You know what? Let's think about that. So, if our members in Europe, and we'll have 650 million active users, have to spend €1 per user redesigning their systems, reprinting their terms and conditions, reprinting their contracts, reprinting their websites, that's 650 million euro. Will it enhance privacy? No, I don't think it will. Let's take the example of the UK and the implementation of the cookie rules. I think the UK is probably the only country so far that's fully implemented it. And you know what? It's not working, is it? Because most people are going, why are they doing that? Because it's so frustrating that wherever you go, you get another notice. I get one all the time. And what it's doing is undermining privacy because people are not reading the notice. They're not understanding that there are privacy implications and consequences. They're just saying, oh, for goodness sake, let's get rid of it. And they press the button because they want to move on. So how does privacy law consider user experience? How does it cost for that user experience? Because you have to design things in particular ways. There are thousands of mobile devices. There are, okay, maybe 3 or 4 dominant platforms, but there are thousands of devices. Nonetheless, I have 2. I love mobile so much. I have 2 platforms I like to share. So how do we design for that? I think that's a major issue. I think there was another EU study done by Catherine Tucker that found that the e-privacy rules in Europe decreased the effectiveness of online advertising by 65%. I think we need to really think about some of these things, to be honest. So let's have a look at some of the costs. What are the costs? Yeah, I know I've got 1 minute 42 according to my timer. You know, I'm on British time, GMT, not CET. Sorry, guys. And, you know, and things have to be different, don't they? You know, the other day I had to agree to a 23,693-word privacy policy on my mobile phone. When I started reading that policy, I was Auburn. When I got to the end, I was this color. It took me that long. So we have to do things differently, and that's a cost, isn't it? How do we redesign for getting away from the fact that we've architected and engineered systems and processes and experiences for hard privacy law that doesn't reflect user reality? When I go into the doctor's surgery, and the doctor says, okay, Pat, this is wrong, you've got to go to these 5 different institutions, we're going to share these data. Does he sit me down and get my explicit consent for each piece of that? Denying the person behind me an opportunity to get medical assistance? No. Because in that context, and that context of trust, it's dealt with. How do we get that context of trust into these other environments? How do we get regulators and policymakers to think differently about engineering, about doing things for consumers? I think, you know, Vivian Redding estimated that the proposed regulation will save €2.3 billion in Europe. And that's by harmonizing the rules, by removing requirements to notify regulators when it's really not relevant to notify regulators. But I don't know the detail of that 2.3 billion. I'd love to see the detail of that 2.3 billion euro saving, because I think there are going to be more costs coming along by the requirement, for example, to name a data protection officer. Whoa, so you put Pat Walshe down on your contracts, your terms and conditions, your website, and I leave the company and I move to somewhere else. You've got to reprint all of that. What is the cost? These are some of the practical elements. Sorry, I'm definitely out of time. These are some of the costs, I think, for me. There are other things that, if I can just have 1 minute, is that okay? Go on. God, I've been suffering from cold, so my brain hasn't been working as well. I've had man flu. Okay, so it's true, isn't it, that you know, context is really king. Mobile has brought about this connectedness. So if I think of the new European proposals are going to include location data in the definition of personal data. What does location data mean? Location data is not just where I live. That could be my postcode. It's not just where I am now. It's where I'm not. It's where I'm not expected to be. It's what direction I've just traveled. It's which way I'm facing at the moment. It's many things. It's who and what I'm connected to. It's the context. And that, with that ability, that wonderful ability, is driving economic opportunities because I can search locally, I can find who's around me, I can share information about a discount in this place, an offer here. I use that quite a lot, and that's fabulous. But when I look at these rules, are those rules fit for the reality that people are now enmeshed in? Are themselves, they've become broadcasters and publishers of data. It's no longer the old world. And I don't have any manifesto to promote or in a position.
Thank you so much, Pat. Okay, there's some language movement here, so I would prevent myself from making comments further. We understand there is some debate on consent, there is some debate even on the meaning of privacy. Just as a note, on the new regulation, the word privacy, as I understand, is never mentioned. It's always data protection, so there is a leap forward by the Commission. We're talking about Europe and the US, correctly, you talk about global privacy, global data protection. That's something we should talk about as well. Just for a matter of knowledge, they united, the ITU, the agency of the UN, is going to, you know, probably reshape the internet. And in their definition, they are talking about data protection, and they are giving a definition of data protection that is very ambiguous. So even at that level, there's, you know, talking about data, there is some concern, not just about the internet freedom, also about the data protection. So just as a little note. I want first to start from my four panelists, if you have any points. So I will start with Ed, then Luca, and again, Daniele, and a short minute to Pat as well. Please, Ed.
First, hopefully I'd like to alter what you said about the ITU reshaping the internet. We do not need the internet reshaped by the ITU. That is not a goal. It is something to be feared if it is seriously attempted. The internet's really doing pretty well. I think that's what, at the core of what we're saying. Yeah, there are problems, there are bumps, and we have a lot of things that need to be addressed. But for somebody to say, well, let's sit down and reshape it. No, we're not there. A couple comments. You know, we're working on privacy laws and regulations, and I don't mean to suggest by emphasizing disclosure that there's not a role for regulations, but the thrust of what I was trying to communicate is that you really need a multi-stakeholder approach. You need to be very cautious and careful. You need to not have an overly prescriptive top-down approach, that there are tremendous significance and consequences when we regulate in this area. And that there is a great deal that can be done by building a disclosure and follow-up regime that relies on trust, because we do have a competitive marketplace. And whether it's Microsoft competing with Google or who else, you know, we are going to see situations, people say, you know what, use us and you're going to get this level of protection, and use somebody else if you want a different level. So the marketplace has a great role here. The other thing I would quickly say is, partly in reaction to Daniel, we'll get into whether or not what you own. Please identify for me the facts that, you know, are your data. The ownership concept, I think, is very problematic. But to the extent that we have a lot of governments around the world who are saying, here are the privacy rules and regs that we want the private sector to abide by, I would urge that if any government who's saying that, ask yourself whether your Defense Department, your intelligence agencies, your economic development agencies would abide by the same restrictions on data. Because if the answer is no, okay, then you've got a really hypocritical situation, and you've got an imbalance, because frankly the same data is going to be used by different institutions. So recognizing when the governments want to protect, and the privacy, privacy data privacy, whatever, that there are costs and consequences to institutions that want and have a need for that data. There are limits on what should be done. Data can be misused. It can be terribly misused. But the refusal to recognize that the rules that want to be applied to the private sector could wreak havoc to governmental activity is just constantly amazing to those of us who are working with governments on rules in this area.
Thank you, Ed. Luca, Ed is giving us a very, I would say, US-centric approach or you say US privacy-centric approach. Is there a chance for Europeans to get closer to the US? We do need to do that? Do we need to do that?
No, I don't think that we have to get closer to US. I think that we have to be closer to current times. We have to update, not only upgrade, update our laws, our rules. So I agree with your view, and it is relevant and paramount to put on the same level, for example, different players. There are OTT having rules, respecting laws that were less strict, less. But anyway, the solution cannot be, in my opinion, to put on the same old level. No, I agree. I think that is the opportunity in order to put all together on a better level, on an upgraded but also updated level. So, and I come back to consent. I'm really concerned about the processing and the possibilities of choice and the transparency of processing, of data processing after consent or over consent. But in my opinion, what is important is to know which are the powers of users, the powers of data subjects when the data processing starts, after the data processing starts. The consent is a barrier, is something that you put before the starting of data processing. And in my opinion, it is not something useful. I agree that there is a right, there is a fundamental right. We have to make it respected by companies, also by governments. ITU, I will speak at ITU in Dubai next week, just about the security and new ITRs, etc., etc. So I'm really concerned about data processing by governments. Anyway, I think we should think about the transparency of processing of data. We should think about it and not about consent, because consent is something that does not ensure anything, does not guarantee anything. I don't trust in my data controller because he's asking a click, a flag online. I want to know everything about data processing. I want to be able to opt out. I want to be able to know where are my data. Yes, I agree. But consent is not the solution.
Right, that's what I said. But yeah, sure.
Dival is in the details. In new proposals for new ITRs, I will speak about this next week. There is a definition of personal data that is incredible. I was reading and rereading twice because it's incredible. Personal data is only the data identifying, directly identifying a person or the data on the basis of which I can identify that person. What about qualities? What about other data that are sensitive data but are not the directly identifying data, or the data on the basis of which? So they put this definition. This is a detail. This is a technical detail, a legalese detail, but it is something enormous, huge in the effects, in the potential effects, if new ITRs will be there.
Okay, just a comment on this. I understand why we want to deregulate a market for economic reasons. We can make the same, obviously I think even pharmaceutical companies would love a deregulated market where they could sell things over the counter, okay? And same things for commercial companies. It would be very nice if I could have all access to data and do what I want with it, whether it is selling it to a third party, or even in the case of Amazon, we are all obviously having previous information and reusing it to give suggestion is great to us. Now, even Google autocomplete is a fantastic way, but I have a few stories of people that were going to be hired, and the autocomplete had his name with rapist after it, because Google autocompleted, it was the most common search, okay? So if we talk about these autocomplete features that help us by looking at what previous people looked at, or even that look at our previous choices, obviously we can look at the good economic service or the advantage that we could have with customers. My point is the following: I can agree and consent to it, and I do think consent should always be part of it, because privacy, again, here we're talking about data privacy, but privacy could be the same also as physical or bodily privacy. What if people started touching you and said, well, no, you gave up your right of privacy or your territorial privacy in your own house, and they start coming in? Why can't we see data or my own personal information in the same way as we see our house, our clothes, our persona, how we see also our freedom to be judged from others in terms of spiritual and intellectual privacy? So I don't see any differences amongst all of this. So yes, we do need new rules for the future. The old ones don't protect us enough, but we should see data just as the way as we see our own property. So in that way, we do need consent, like we need consent for people to come inside our house. And again, we can make stories here about how good it is to have so much data. I can do targeted advertising, and I do have some data on advertising, and I know that some companies are suffering from new European regulations. And the data I've got here is from 2010, and they looked at the advertising effectiveness in the EU, and how that's it. So basically companies are losing money from all this regulation. But the only ones that are losing money are generalist websites, and not websites that sell only one product or one typology of products. So Google would lose money, but not Amazon, just to give an idea of this.
Thank you, Daniele.
Thank you.
Pat, before we open up to the...
Okay, yeah, I mean, for me, we need a policy, we need regulatory framework that recognizes that there are different categories of data, that you have personal data, network data, for example, aggregated data, and that, for me, I hate this term, data protection. I don't want to be protected, I want to be empowered. How do we create a framework that empowers both individuals, business, and governments? That must be built on effective transparency, effective choice, effective control to generate this trust, because trust is crucial to the market. We don't have to look at the financial services sector around the world to understand how trust has been eroded. And I think, just 2 seconds, there are some tools emerging that are going to empower users. So there's one that came out yesterday. If you use Firefox or Chrome browser, then just have a look for Privacy Fix. You can Bing it. You can Google it. If you're privacy conscious, you can Xquix it using a privacy-friendly search engine. And what that will do is reveal the value of your data, your Facebook data to Facebook and Google. So a guy that wrote a story about it this morning, for example, found that it was only worth 51 cents to Facebook, but it was worth $1,095 to Google. Now, that's going to change things. That level of transparency that's been driven, and what we find is that the market, because of perceived failures in policy and regulation, is giving rise to new privacy tools, transparency tools, and tools to control your data. Great, I love it.
Thank you, Pat. I would like to make so many comments and leave the floor, but we have unfortunately a data time restraint here. I want to open to the floor, this part of the floor, this part of the table. If we can gather 3 questions to start, whoever wants, please raise your hand.
I'd be interested in hearing from one or more of the panelists that mentioned enforcement, and once some of these other questions have been resolved, what do you do on the enforcement front? It was the part of the opening comments of at least a couple of you, and it's where every regulation either stands or falls, and I'm just interested to hear from the panelists about what would be viable moving forward.
Thanks, Paul. Other question? Rita, please.
So just continue the line here. I think it's interesting to see, you know, the differences of the approach, and what I always try to do is to try to see where we can find a compromise, because as a lobbyist, of course, the closer you get to the compromise, the more effective you can be. And I was having a discussion earlier this week with one of the academics from or a law professor from the US, and he put forward an idea of a code of conduct. And the code of conduct in a different way of, you know, usually when we think about code of conduct, it's adding to the requirements that we have already. But what he proposed is, why don't we kind of use the concept of code of conduct to create like a safe harbor in terms of, to allow, and going back to the previous panel, of experimenting. So why don't we kind of use the code of conduct to allow companies who are working towards privacy-friendly technology to experiment with data, and that can be opt-in or opt-out, that's different. But I'm just wanting to test this concept with you, Daniele, and maybe even with Ms. Richards, whether this is something that is feasible from a European perspective. Can we use code of conduct in this way?
You mean market self-regulation? So I give a code of conduct in business, is that what
Yeah,
you're
so I'm
asking?
thinking about a code of conduct that business would say, okay, we're working towards a technology that is really about, I don't know, what we talked about in the previous panel, putting the user back in control, or find the technical ways. But because of the enforcement, I do think that the enforcement is important, because we can have all the legislation of the world if nobody is enforcing it. I agree. But you know, if we have the 2% annual worldwide turnover, who will dare to experiment? And this was my discussion with this law professor of like, okay, we have this enforcement, but if we can create a bit of safe harbor for like 2, 3, 4 years for companies, using this code of conduct who committed to work towards privacy technologies, yet you know, we would relax some of the obligations from the directive. Would that be something acceptable for you? And I think it's also a question from Ms.
Thank you, Rita. Another question, and then we go to the answers, please. Caroline.
Yes, I just wanted to add a question that a lot of the discussion this morning is talking about data that is associated with the user. In other words, the user is an active participant within the transaction. Now, in the first panel, we heard a lot about big data, where data is actually being passively collected, and I think one of the speakers here also speaks about data that is inferred. So one of the questions I wanted to ask is, how do you think, or what do you think would be the appropriate policy framework to look at regulating passively collected data and also inferred and observed data?
Well, yeah, I mean, well, codes of conduct, because, hey, you know, I've worked with operators around the world, and we've developed a set of mobile privacy design guidelines for mobile application development. We're implementing these. So between them, those operators represent 1.2 billion people. It's for their own apps. But, you know, here's a demonstration of what can be done. I support codes of conduct. But I'm also involved in the US development with the NTIA on a code of conduct for mobile app privacy. Well, you know, it's dealing with transparency. It requires much more than transparency. Someone stood up at the first NTI meeting and said, you know what, by the time you deal with all these other things, such as choice and control, it'll be 7 years. So yes, we need them. Yes, they have to be interoperable, but they have to have fundamental core principles that are established in different frameworks around the world, whether that's 108, OECD, 9546. There are core principles that are common throughout these. Now, surely we ought to, if we can land a man on the moon, surely we ought to be able to figure this stuff out.
Just to answer your question, I do believe that this code of conduct, I also worked for a few operators in the UK myself. I was in a consortium for a while. And I think we need both. You cannot leave the industry to self-regulate. At the same time, you cannot, it's much better if the industry self-regulates in a way, because so the government doesn't have to step in because people are upset. So it's even cheaper for taxpayer, if you will. However, again, what should this code of conducts be based on? And who should oversee them? Should there be a company on top of all the others that looks at privacy and implements it across all of them in a uniform way? In any case, you do have to create perhaps an industry consortium to decide what it should be across the board, I believe.
But I think my main question, sorry, I'm taking the floor quickly, but with the principle of using the code of conduct of saying, okay, if you have like a consortium of 20 companies, and then these companies are working towards the technology that would be privacy friendly, but then let's say thinking that the regulation chapter 4 of impact assessment and I don't know, having a privacy officer and whatever checklist documenting all the requirements. Of course, this is really burdensome. So can we use, for example, the code of conduct in, let's say, a creative way, saying, okay, you can get out of those requirements for 3 years or 4 years. And then, you know, because you're working towards something that is going to be creating more privacy. Or can we say, okay, we're not going to fine you if, or we're going to kind of use the enforcement in a more relaxed way, because you know you may fall at one point of the edge of the cliff if you kind of walking, you know, in an uncertain area. And then I go back to the point of Jacques of like experimenting. You never know where you're going to end up. Can we use the code of conduct this way?
But again, I don't know what you mean by experimenting, but let me give you an example. Facebook has experimented with big data by creating, for instance, I found out that most people between 18 and 25 end their relationship around June, I believe, at the beginning of summer for some reason, and then they get back together in September. So if you're asking if such data aggregation is fine, in my opinion, yes it is. It's completely anonymized. So big data in that way, it is fine. So for instance, if you go to my profile, obviously you cannot even see my status as a person because I'm paranoid. But I mean, if you really want to give that sort of information to Facebook, and Facebook uses it in that sort of aggregate way, then it is fine. Again, if you tell me that a company has decided, for instance, like it did Facebook a few years ago, you made a purchase and automatically connected to your profile and told all your friends you bought those fantastic shoes that costed $1,000, then I would say then your experiment has failed because you haven't asked for my consent. So I think the rule of thumb is as long as you inform in a simple way, because the user needs to understand what happens with their data, then it's fine. And then you are within the law. I believe that.
Luca? Rapidly. I think that codes of conduct can be included in my idea. The idea of certification linked to the legitimate interest specification. But anyway, both certification and codes of conduct should meet the approval of European Commission. So the last word is of European Commission, as it is written the regulation, the proposal. So I do think that some amendments could empower European Commission more clearly and specifically in order to approve codes of conduct or certifications, and acknowledge that if you meet the requirements of the certification, you have been certified, or you participate to the code of conduct, you cannot ask, for example, I come back, you cannot request user's consent. This could be a solution in the hands of European Commission. We did not talk about criminal laws, but it is relevant because you know that I hope in the regulation will remain an article that extend the exemption from responsibility to information society providers for user-generated contents, but that is another big issue because we in Italy know very well that it is a dangerous job to give information society services and to give services to users in order to make them able to generate contents online. We have strict criminal laws in our privacy code, and the provider risks to be risks a trial because a user shared a content online, and this is a big issue also for the economic impact that it has immediately. So we did not speak about this, but I think it was important to cite it.
Thank you, Luca. Ed, if you want to respond to Caroline.
Yeah, a little bit.
And I think Luca responded partly to Paul.
First of all, with regard to code of conduct and guidelines, yes. Obviously, they're useful. How they are, how prescriptive they are, how much they're used down the road as guidelines for something more permanent, you've got to address. The other thing is, though, code of conduct, we're dealing with many different kind of businesses and industries. So somebody may have a fairly detailed set of code of conduct that makes sense for this category of businesses, but they don't necessarily translate to everybody else in the internet ecosystem. And so you start getting something which is for everybody, and either it gets dumbed down to nothing or it gets ridiculously complicated and detailed. With regard to the enforcement question, yeah, I think enforcement is very important, but as what I try to say in my comments is the one place we're very comfortable with enforcement is because there is a marketplace, and we think there is privacy can be substantially protected by a dynamic marketplace where there's real competition for the privacy interest, if you will, that it is the enforcement role of honesty, of making sure that when you have a privacy policy, you have transparency, you have disclosures, that you're not doing deceptive practices. And that gets you a long way, and it gives a substantial tool and encourages companies to be transparent, well, hopefully, if but you have transparency and can have enforcement there. But all this, again, I just want to just step back and put the backdrop of that our conference. Data-driven, it's not a privacy conference per se, and it's the economic cost of that. And as much as privacy is vitally important and it's something we want to protect, so is, as Article 19 says, the freedom of expression, and I would suggest the freedom of expression encompasses the ability to get information, to learn, to be knowledgeable, to be an informed person. And so you have a clash of values here. It's not just one value to protect against economic interests. There are vital interests that have to be weighed.
Thank you so much. I guess we still have 5 minutes. I want to take a few other questions. Michael, please.
Hi. So I have a question about informed consent, and it kind of goes to something that Michael said earlier about youth and different generations. Has anyone done a study, know of a study where, I mean, most of us just click yes on privacy, maybe not everyone on this panel, but a lot of us do. But if you actually sit down people, explain to them what is in the privacy policy and what isn't, do people's behaviors change? And does it impact by generation? I mean, in other words, will transparency make a difference if people's behavior doesn't change regardless of what happens, what they know about what's going to happen to them?
Last question.
Yeah, it does make a difference. There's a company called Create with Context. You can go to their website, just Bing, Google, or Xquix them, Create with Context. And they did some real in-depth studies, social behavioral studies, where they let people explore their mobile phones, for example, and just let them explore it. And then they showed them the privacy policy and the shock of people when they discovered what was happening with their data. Was quite interesting, particularly when you have a flashlight app, so it turns your mobile phone into a flashlight. It was using your location data. Why does it need my location data? So, I mean, we've done research amongst 4,000 people in Spain and in Singapore and in the UK, and we've just commissioned some in Latin America, where we look at people's concerns. I want to tell you one story. It'll take less than 1 minute about the intergenerational thing. I recently parked up at the supermarket with my little boy who's 10, and somebody pulled into the disabled parking bay, and a friend of mine has broken her leg, but she can't park in the bay because she doesn't have the right permit, so she has to hobble across the car park. But in this bay, while I was waiting for my wife, this guy turned up in his open-top Lamborghini sports car, hopped out, and went into the supermarket. And I said to my son, that makes me so cross. I feel like taking a photograph and putting it on Twitter. And he's 10, bear in mind. He said, but Daddy, you'll have to pixelate his number plate first to protect his privacy. So kids do get it.
Thank you so much. Smart kid, I would say. Okay, I'm stopping here. I know there are more comments, and we'll have a chance to discuss during lunch. We have a great speaker guest during lunch, so I'm very welcoming the speaker as well. But I want to thank everybody. I want to thank Ed, Luca, Pat, and Daniele for their participation. All of you for being here. And Will, I would say that we have a great speeches, but also 3 great ideas that came from this floor. So I guess we really enhanced the debate today. Thank you so much.
And we had a great moderator.
Thank you, Pietro. There were some concrete suggestions that are very creative and interesting. Now we're going to go upstairs to the terrace for lunch, and we do have the privilege of hearing from Megan Williams. So please, work your way up for lunch, and we'll reconvene there.